Thanks for joining us on our weekly AJA Zoom event. Welcome to the people watching live on Zoom and on Facebook, and to those hearing the replay on JAIR Community Radio and YouTube. My name is Robert Gregory, CEO of AJA, and tonight we are honored to have one of our generation's preeminent thinkers, Yoram Hazony. Yoram and I will have a discussion, and then we will take some audience questions. So as usual, put up your hand up to ask a question, and we may preference some people who don't normally ask questions. Yoram Hazony was raised in America and lives in Israel. He is a philosopher, a Bible scholar, and a political theorist. He's president of the Herzl Institute in Jerusalem and is chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation. He is the author of multiple books, including The Virtue of Nationalism and his most recent book, Conservatism, A Rediscovery. Yoram has 9 children, so he's very invested in the future of this world. So thank you so much for joining us, Yoram.
A pleasure to meet you, Robert, and thank you to you and to Neil and Alan and everyone else who makes this possible.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to start by turning to nationalism. So in Australia, we see a lot of hatred for things like the Australian flag, Australia's National Day, Australia Day, our anthem. So to work out what's going on, what is nationalism and why does the left hate it?
Well, this is a very old question, and I think the easiest place to begin is by thinking about why it is that we want to have a world of independent nations. Why should Australia be an independent nation at all? Because another very old way of thinking about ordering the world is that nations just cause wars. They cause wars, famines, disease, bloodshed, oppression, and so already in biblical times we have all sorts of examples of ideologically motivated empire. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, later the Persians, all of them have this roughly the same theory, which goes, the way to bring peace and prosperity to the world is to conquer all the nations and have a single ruler who simply makes the decisions for everyone. Right? And Western history is kind of a seesaw between, we could say, the biblical Jewish view that says that Israel and many other nations should be independent of these empires, which are in fact evil, and the Roman view that says, no, peace and prosperity will be brought to the world if we just have one people that conquers everyone else. So it's been that same story, more or less, for a very, very long time. People who are on the side of let's say, founding an independent Jewish state in Israel. These are nationalists. And their argument is that the only way that the Jews as a people can be free is by having a country of their own that's independent and makes its own decisions, pursues its own interests, develops its own traditions. And the same is believed by nationalists in many countries. So Americans believe in American independence, and Brits in British independence, and so on, with Poles and Hungarians and French and Italians and Japanese and Indians and many others. But there's constantly this anti-nationalist pressure, this post-nationalist pressure that you see in international organizations like the European Union, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, and so on. All of these begin with the idea that no, there should just be one rule of law, and there really shouldn't be independent nations. It would be better if we are just part of one large liberal empire.
So that takes me to my next question. And so we hear a lot of these buzzwords, globalization, world government, new world order, Klaus Schwab, WEF. So why is world government so bad for everyone?
Well, it's not necessarily bad if you don't want to be able to make your own decisions. World government means imperial government. Imperial government means that there's an emperor, and he makes the decisions for everyone. The tradition that's handed down to us as Jews, the tradition of the prophets, is one that that assumes that if Israel has its own king, which is a demand that Moses makes in Deuteronomy, that it has its own borders, its own king, it has its own prophets, it has what we today call self-determination, then the Jews will be free to develop their own way of doing things, to live according to the Torah or the Jewish tradition, and to find their own way to God. And then other peoples will have that same freedom. If you don't value that freedom, then and you don't think it's important to have what I guess today would be called a world of diversity, a world in which there are many different nations. Edmund Burke once said that each nation is an experiment in how human beings should live. If you don't want these many experiments and you just think you have the right answer, then I guess you would support a universal world government.
So turning to our region here, China's benefited a lot from the international world order. A lot of manufacturing has moved there. So it's a question on a lot of Australians' minds, and I guess a lot of people in the world. How should the world relate to China?
I don't think that there's terribly much question about China's aspirations. China believes that it has the best system and the best people, and it would be perfectly happy to rule all of the other nations, and it's doing a good job of getting there, from what I can see. Whereas the United States, which is full of ideological pretensions, especially on the left, but also in kind of the liberal center, the United States is full of ideological pretensions that the United States knows how to govern the world best. And since 1989, its leaders have been talking about a new world order in which there would be a single rule of law that would be conducted by Americans and Europeans. It doesn't seem to me that the Americans are doing a very good job of convincing people that they actually know what they're doing, which definitely creates an opening for China.
So, I mean, that's a big concern for everyone here. I'm sure we'll explore that issue a bit more. But turning to conservatism, it seems like it's under attack, and there's a concerted effort to destroy the institutions of the West, like religion, church, traditional marriage, even the definition of a man and a woman. So how do you define conservatism, and why is it especially important today?
I think it's easiest to think about conservatism if you begin by thinking about liberalism, because liberalism kind of has been, the dominant ideology in Western countries, at least since the Second World War. And I think it's reasonable to say that beginning around around 2020, there's been this cultural revolution which aims to overthrow the liberals and impose kind of a neo-Marxist, a version of neo-Marxism. But for most of the last 60, 70 years, liberalism was the dominant worldview. It's a view that says that you know what you need to know about politics if you can agree that human beings are perfectly free and perfectly equal by nature, and that moral and political obligations are only undertaken by virtue of consent. So that's a famous worldview. It's been dominant for a long time. Less famous at this point is the older Anglo-American conservatism, which is a a view that I assume has at least some traction in Australia. This is a view that begins with the question, what do we need to do if our nation is going to preserve itself and propagate and grow and be healthy over the coming generations, maybe the coming centuries? And when you begin by asking that question, it doesn't, you don't necessarily reach the conclusion that that rights are unimportant. There are many nationalists who are extremely concerned for human and individual rights. But a conservative begins with the question of what do we need to do in order to propagate, in order to preserve ourselves, in order to conserve ourselves? And that question, and here I recommend my book on conservatism for those who are interested, that question quickly leads you to a very, very different way of thinking about human beings. Conservatives think of human beings as being born into families, clans, tribes, and nations, families of nations. Each of us is born not free and equal, but actually at the bottom of a family hierarchy, and we're introduced to a way of life. That hierarchy is the way in which human beings by nature propagate their different ideas about how to live, is that the younger people in a healthy society give honor to the older people, and as a consequence of giving honor to the older people, they open themselves up to learning and to receiving and to transmitting. So if you've have any experience with, let's say, a traditional Jewish community, then you know that the commandment to honor your father and your mother, and the commandment to honor your elders are taken extremely seriously, because that is the key for handing down the Torah. And it's those commandments which make it possible for us as a people to survive over thousands of years. What's happening in the West today is that there is has been a very rapid replacement of this kind of conservatism, which is built on conservation and transmission of ideas and of a way of life. There's been a very fast transition from that to liberalism, which has no interest in conserving anything. Liberalism by itself is only interested in the question of whether you are equal and free. And so the whole question of conservation just doesn't arise. Today, we're looking at Western societies in which the chain of transmission, whether it's of Christianity and Judaism, or the chain of transmission of constitutional inheritance and a historical inheritance, all of these chains have been broken now for several generations, which raises a question of whether these countries, which are concerned only for freedom and not for their own continuity, whether they have a future.
Well, I mean, so turning to the individual then, I mean, we hear what's, perhaps a pessimistic view of things, but people on the left, it seems like there's a lot of virtue signaling. So we see everyone writes what gender they are. In Australia, a big thing is they add like a little prayer for Aboriginals at the bottom of their email addresses and at the beginning of every meeting and event. So the left is certainly bringing in a lot of things, but what can conservative people, Jewish people that have center-right values, what can we do in our personal lives to ensure that society is preserved?
This is a subject that appears in my book. I think it's important when we think about being conservative that we think on two different levels. One level, is the question of public affairs and public policy, and questions like, should you say a prayer for the Aboriginals, which I don't have an opinion on because I don't know anything about it, but that's a level of kind of society-wide policies. But society doesn't live on on public policy alone. The primary arena in which conservatism takes place is in living a conservative life. Conservative life would mean that the hierarchy, the social hierarchy that we were discussing, which transmits values, is the most important thing in people's lives. So if you are, kind of an individual or a family that has been cut off from the chain of transmission, as most people have been, then the first thing you need to do is you need to locate a society, which is not always, but is usually these days, an Orthodox congregation, an Orthodox Jewish congregation, or an Orthodox Christian congregation might also be of that kind. But if you're Jewish, then you should find yourself an Orthodox or a very traditional kind of a community in which young people can attach themselves to older people as models. So this would mean focusing much more than liberal society usually does, focusing on making sure that marrying early, having a large family, being part of a congregation in which you can learn how to inherit and transmit to future generations. All of these things are very, very basic. And, I often find people who are politically conservative, they call themselves conservatives. And if you talk to them about, the family and the nation and tradition, even God and scripture, they'll say, oh, yes, I'm in favor of those things. But when it comes to their personal lives, they're just liberals. I have in mind various people I know who are they're in their mid-30s and living with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, not connected to any synagogue, not keeping Sabbaths, not knowing anything about their inheritance, and not having children to bequeath that inheritance to. Well, so it doesn't matter if you vote conservative. If you're living a liberal life, then you are not helping with this tremendous civilizational crisis that we're in the midst of.
So that observation about people who are perhaps aren't actually conservatives segues into my next question. What do you think about the so-called conservative political parties, whether in the United States, the UK, Australia's another example. In general, what do you think of parties calling themselves conservative today?
Right. Well, again, I'll have to emphasize that my knowledge of Australia is very limited. So if I'm making a mistake with regard to Australia, I'm sure you'll correct me. But in America and Europe, since World War II, there's been a tendency, at least let's say since the 1960s, to confuse conservatism with liberalism. I've already said that these two things, it's crucial to keep them apart, because one of them is about conservation and transmission, and the other is about freedom, which is almost the opposite. And so they stand in a certain necessary tension with one another. But during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was busy promoting communism around the world, and it looked like it might actually triumph throughout the world, and when socialism and communism were growing quickly in the domestic politics of most Western countries, an alliance was forged between liberals and conservatives, between anti-Marxist liberals who correctly understood that communism and Marxism are a formula for enslavement and oppression. So there were such liberals, and they created an alliance with traditionalists, conservatives, who are more concerned with how society maintains decent common standards for how we live together. And that alliance of liberals and conservatives was given the name of fusionism. I don't know if any of you have ever heard that term before, but in the mid-60s, the technical term that the intellectuals gave this alliance of anti-Marxist liberals with anti-Marxist conservatives, they called it fusionism. And why was it called fusionism? Because the conceit was that they had discovered a way to actually fuse liberalism and conservatism into one thing. I won't keep you in suspense. The basic idea was that we'll be liberals in our public life and conservatives at home. And that's the source of the idea of using the term conservative to describe political parties that are libertarian or liberal and are primarily concerned with freedom and barely concerned at all with questions like the one you raised before. What kind of an economic policy would we need if we wanted to make sure that Australia has a future? So all of this was still, I think, not completely clear in the 1980s. The Reagan and Thatcher years are still an alliance, a coalition of liberals and libertarians with conservatives of different kinds. But as soon as you get to 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, something very, very radical happens. Communism is gone, and there's kind of this utopian, this explosion of utopian fervor. And instead of what, when I was a young man and editing a pro-Reagan magazine, a pro-Thatcher magazine on my university campus, we all thought that when the Cold War ended, that the result would be that the troops would go home and we would go back to having a world of independent nations. But that isn't what happened. Within a few months of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we already had Charles Krauthammer writing about universal dominion, a world empire is the goal. And by 1990, you had George H.W. Bush talking about the New World Order, in which what was the New World Order? Well, he said that for 100 generations, mankind has struggled to try to achieve what's about to happen now, but we're about to achieve it. And the it was that the law of the jungle was going to be replaced by the rule of law, meaning the rule of a single, all-encompassing global law that was going to embrace the entire planet. And we had 25 years or so between 1990 and let's say 2016, between the fall of the Berlin Wall and Brexit and Trump in 2016, we had an entire generation in which the term conservative had nothing to do with conservatism. The term conservative was used to describe this kind of Napoleonic ambition that there should be worldwide liberalism that America would impose either by persuasion, and if not, then by force of conquest. So we're in a somewhat strange place since 2016 because the popular rebellion on the right is in many respects nationalist, and it's in many respects conservative. It's a mix of people looking at this liberal, internationalist, Napoleonic one world order and criticizing it in different ways. So some of the criticism is simply nationalist. Our people and its traditions should be allowed to maintain their independent course, and we don't need Brussels or New York or Washington dictating our laws to us and how we should live. So that's the nationalist aspect. But the conservative aspect that you've already alluded to is that this one world order is wrapped up in a way that is proving impossible to disentangle. The New World Order is being advanced and governed by woke neo-Marxists. The old idea that there would be a liberal world order has collapsed into this woke neo-Marxism, so that I think, certainly to my surprise, we thought that we nationalists and conservatives had a fight, had a beef with worldwide liberalism, with worldwide liberal empire. But in the last few years, it's transmogrified into something that is hardly liberal at all anymore, and is simply a revolutionary movement that makes no bones about the fact that it is hostile to God and Scripture, to family and nation, to honor and tradition, to man and woman, all of these very, very basic ideas that 50 or 60 years ago, most liberals would have said that they agree with conservatives on these things. But at this point, we have an overwhelming acceptance among elites of this cultural revolution, and so we are facing really a new politics in which nationalist conservatives face off against woke neo-Marxists, and the liberals who still exist. There are such people, but that liberal center, which is not, is still holding out against Marxism, is shrinking rapidly.
So turning to Israel, which many people would say is an outlier in terms of both nationalism and conservatism, would you agree with that description? What can you explain maybe why that's so, and what the rest of the world can learn about from what's happening in Israel?
Well, Israel was founded by a variety of nationalist parties, so it's a little bit different from other Western countries in that that people, Jews between the world wars, or even if you go back to the 1880s, I would say, Jews who were not so interested in nationalism, in Jewish nationalism, and the idea of Jewish independence and Jewish restoration, they were able to go to Britain and to the United States, millions of them, and to take up their political cause as Jewish liberals, as Jewish socialists. Israel's a different case because it was founded by nationalists. And I think we often make a mistake. People talk about Ben Gurion and Katzenelson and their generation as though they were Tabenkin, as though they were some kind of liberal nationalists. They in fact were hardly liberal. They were traditionalists. They were not in every respect, obviously, but in many respects, they expected that, for example, that all Jewish children should go to school and learn Tanakh, learn the Bible. That's, you can say, oh, it wasn't really religious, it was secular. I think this is kind of a misunderstanding. All of these labor Zionist founders of the state of Israel, by the way, my family comes from the labor Zionist part of the Zionist movement, and I wrote a book about this called The Jewish State, The Struggle for Israel's Soul. So I think people simply forget that Ben Gurion's generation consisted of young radicals who came to Israel having grown up in traditional Orthodox Jewish homes in Eastern Europe. And the the fact that they stopped observing many of the particulars of our halakha, of our inherited Jewish law, doesn't change the fact that their framework for thinking about the world was in fact very religious. Ben-Gurion often spoke of Zionism as a messianic movement, Tnuah Meshichit. And what he meant by this is that that Zionism is based on a biblical vision which guides both political arguments internal to Israeli society and also the vision of Israel's place in the world. So whether you fully accept that or not, I think all of this does make Israel, to this day, a very special kind of a place that national conservatives, in America and Europe, look to see, how could they improve their own societies. It's surprising, but Israel is the only, as far as I know, the only industrialized nation in the world that has a birth rate above replacement. Israeli Jews have more than 3 children per woman, and that number has been basically growing for the last 20 years. It's been rising. This is almost double the birth rate in most liberal societies in the West. So there's all sorts of interpretations of what exactly is going on, but roughly, Israel is just in many ways a much more conservative society. Even the so-called secular Israelis, they all have a mezuzah on their door, and they all have a Passover Seder, and much more than half of society keeps the laws of ritual purity, which Jews in most countries don't even know about. And as I already mentioned, learning Bible in the schools, serving in the military, defending your country. This is all today considered very, very nationalist and very conservative.
And I think what's also unique in Israel is as the generations get younger, they get even more conservative and nationalist when it comes to voting and things like that. All right, but we're at the halfway mark, so before we go to some audience Q&A, just a reminder to everyone, put your hand up if you want to ask a question. I can see we've got a few hands up, so make sure to do that. Someone's posted in the chat a link to Yoram's to purchase his books, and we might, for those just listening, Yoram, do you want to mention where people can buy your books?
Well, I don't know how you buy books in Australia, but in America and Europe, you can get my books on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all of the other big chains, Book Depository. You can go to my website, yoramhazony.org. There's descriptions of all of the books and links to places where you can buy them.
Perfect. Well, for those listening on JA Radio, this is the AJA Weekly Zoom, and we're here with Yoram Hazony speaking about nationalism and conservatism. So a reminder to everyone, as we usually do, make sure you're following AJA on social media. We're on everything: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, all of them. Make sure you're subscribing to our emails. If you're able to then make a donation. At this time, we need all the support we can get. We're in a big war against anti-Semites and all sorts of bad forces in the world. So all the resources we can get are important. Next week, we'll have Professor Matthew Ogilvie. He'll be speaking about religiously motivated terrorism with a look at the terrorist conscience. So Professor Ogilvie is a professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame. He's taught a university course on religiously motivated terrorism, and he's also currently the chair of Friends of Israel in WA. So we look forward to that. But let's go to some audience questions. First up, we have Courtney. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Just to prove it's possible to buy his books here in Australia, I think I got it off Amazon, but I highly recommend. Amazing, amazing book, Yoram. I just wanted to touch on something that's concerning, just a concerning question. You mentioned a lot in the book, the kind of the post-war secularization of society, removing God from public life, removing prayer from school, and the negative impacts that's had and sort of the knock-on effect through the decades. Facing a state today that has a lot of these woke neo-Marxist elements, how do we sort of defend from the church or the synagogue becoming an agent of soft power of a state that doesn't have our best intentions at heart?
Great question. I think if you follow my my drift in chapter 3, which is the chapter that goes into describing the way that traditions propagate through hierarchies, and chapter 4, the way that families and congregations work as a bulwark for transmitting and repairing and upholding old ideas. If you follow this, then I think one of the very clear conclusions that I think you have to come to is that that families and congregations are the principal resource that the public has for resisting a state whose ideology is dangerous and is being imposed on them by force. So this is not a new idea. I think it's often been pointed out that every totalist or totalitarian movement aims to break down the families and the congregations, because they are the only thing that is actually strong enough to guarantee resistance against a pernicious state. In our time, you know, it's awkward because the governments in Western countries are increasingly vicious, increasingly concerned to persecute conservatives and nationalists and anybody they think is a threat, but they do it in the name of liberalism. You know, they're always talking about how those of us who want the right to have a different opinion, we're the threat. And you know, this should remind you, unfortunately, of the strategy of the Bolsheviks. If you read up on the Soviet revolutionaries, this was their strategy: is that they were always using these beautiful words. They're always talking about freedom and equality, while they were making the actual freedom of people to have their own opinions, their own traditions, and live their own lives impossible. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I think every one of us needs to ask himself or herself, am I in fact part of a very strong, very healthy family and congregation which can serve as a bulwark against the state? And if you are, then your goal should be to bring as many young people and old people as you can into those communities, because that's where the real resistance, work of resistance, is being done.
Good, because those are practical measures. Often we have speakers and they tell us about different problems in the world, but not solutions. So very grateful you're providing actual solutions. And next up, we have Ruvain. Would you like to ask your question?
Hi, thanks, Yoram. Yoram, just as a bit of a background, between 1788 and 1st of January 1901, Australia was made up of colonies. 1st of January 1901 became a constitutional monarchy as a result of a British Act that passed. Now, the political situation in Australia since then has been constitutional monarchy, and it's actually modelled on Am Yisrael, because we became a nation the very first Pesach, and by definition, we also adopted a constitutional monarchy, and to this day, Am Yisrael, we remain a constitutional monarchy, despite the fact that the state of Israel is a republic at the moment. But still, even the fact you've got people in the republic, we are still, and my question is as follows. So in our constitutional monarchy, we became the 71st nation to come about, and we still accept there are 70 root nations plus us, Israel, 71. And that's why on Sukkot, we have various sacrifices each day. Till the end of the 7th day of Sukkot, we sacrifice 70 bulls, represent each of these nations. And on Shemini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, we have one-on-one on our king, Rabbi Shalom. But this took place in Mishkan, the Bet HaMikdash, and we anticipate with it in Zion, the new Bet HaMikdash, this whole system will be repeated. We read it every year, but it will be repeated again.
What's your question, Rabbi?
The question is, doesn't matter whether it's in the state of Israel, whether it's in the diaspora, we are still a constitutional monarchy. And as a chosen nation, we are chosen to bring an everlasting peace on earth via our Torah, which incorporates the Noahide Code for all other nations, which can rule independently within those bounds. And our king is Melech Haolam, is the king of the whole universe. He also king of
what's the question?
The question is, would you accept that every nation in the world should have 7 Noahide acts? Of course you would. Yeah, 7 Noahide acts with associated legislation which comes from the Torah, where the Am Yisrael.
I think, get the questions about the 7 Noahide laws. What are your
yes,
thoughts on?
Well, look, I don't mean to be too controversial, but the idea of the 7 Noahide laws, which are meant to be binding on all nations, it's not clear to me that those laws are in fact the Torah's entire teaching to the nations. It's a little bit more complicated. One of the reasons that I began thinking about this question is because when you dig into English history and more generally Christian history, you find that a great many of the Christian thinkers accepted the 10 Commandments as the basis for the laws of their nations. Aquinas famously argues that all of the 10 Commandments are natural law and that they're binding on Christians. And if you look at the Protestant tradition, you'll find that virtually every significant Protestant thinker argued that the 10 Commandments are the moral minimum for a Christian society. This it raises the question of whether they are disagreeing with the Noahide theory or not. My own view, and I'm far from an expert in this, but my impression is that the Noahide laws are a much lower minimum than the 10 Commandments. I mean, just for an obvious example, the commandment to honor your father and your mother is not included in the Noahide laws, and it's very difficult to say that Christian nations or other nations could really do without that commandment. So I think probably the easiest way to think about this is that the Noahide laws are the absolute minimum that the rabbis consider the absolute minimum for you to be minimally civilized. Who should be allowed to live in Israel when it's governed under Jewish law? Well, it has to be people who at least observe the Noahide laws. But if you're asking, what does the Torah have to teach? When Yeshayahu, Isaiah, or Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, Zechariah, when the prophets talk about the nations coming to Israel to learn the Torah, are they talking only about the 7 Noahide laws? I doubt that. I think that the 7 laws are the absolute minimum, but that the aspiration to learn more appears in almost every healthy nation, and we have an obligation as Jews to teach them at least the principles.
Okay, next up we have Terry.
Hi. The way the world is going seems to be that nations are being subsumed into internationalist bodies like the UN, EU, and we see at the moment that it's enabling a lot of nations to one extent or another to turn on Israel. Israel is probably the greatest example of the successful nation with a people, a religion, and has grown from nothing to what it is today. Do you think that there is going to be pressure that Israel can't resist in the coming years unless some of these internationalist bodies are diluted or done away with altogether?
Well, Israel has had to live with this kind of international pressure for its entire life. We're still a small country. We're no longer a weak country, but we're still a small country, and still have many enemies around us, despite a number of successful peace treaties, and the likelihood that Israel is simply going to be left alone by to do whatever it wants by the nations remains small. On the other hand, you're correctly pointing out that we have a particular problem with these international bodies, with the United Nations and the EU and so on. These international bodies are far more universalist ideologically. They're far more to the left. They used to be far more liberal, and now they're far more Marxist than the populations in almost any Western democratic country. And what that means is that we as Israelis and Jews have a very special interest in the change that's taking place. It used to be, if you go back 50, 60 years, you could still make the case that liberal parties and even even socialist parties were more pro-Israel and pro-Jewish than the parties on the right, and less susceptible to anti-Semitism. There was always anti-Semitism on the left, but you could still make that argument 50, 60 years ago. Today, I think that argument is impossible. There are certainly anti-Semites on the political right and among the nationalists, but they're a very small minority, and their influence is very, very limited. Whereas anti-Semitism on the left, in the left of center parties, among these Marxists, and in these world bodies that are increasingly dominated by them, the anti-Semitism on the left is orders of magnitude more influential. When I say orders of magnitude, I mean 100 or 1,000 times more influential and more dangerous to Jews than the anti-Semitism on the right at the moment. I'm not saying it'll be this way forever, but at the moment, that is the situation. And so we as Jews need to pay very careful attention to the fact that there was an essay that appeared just yesterday by two Protestant nationalist conservatives in a right-wing magazine in the United States, and these two, as far as I know, had never ever written. They're both prominent people. As far as I know, they'd never written about Israel or Jews before, and they published this very powerful essay in which they argued that the people who are defending the atrocities against Israel on October 7th are the same people who would want to do the same thing to Christians and Jews, or maybe to whites in America, and that Christians on the nationalist right need to recognize that Israel is fighting the same fight that they are fighting. Now, I happen to agree with that analysis, but it's interesting that that as the left becomes more and more anti-Semitic, there are more voices on the right who are saying, look, the Israelis and the Jews, or at least the traditional Jews, the conservative Jews, are fighting the same fight that we nationalists are fighting in our own country. Let's ally with them.
Yeah, that's certainly been our experience here at AJA in Australia. I'd say like 95% of anti-Semitism we deal with, it's either from the left or also from Muslims. And yeah, a very small amount from the right. And the anti-Semitism, they're mostly losers. So we don't see them as such a big threat. Next up, we've got Alan.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yoram, I just want to ask you a little bit about the terminology. You're talking about liberals. In this country, we tend to not talk about liberals and leftists, and probably because our Conservative Party is the Liberal Party, just to make life confusing. So is the difference between liberals and leftists simply just a matter of degree? So I guess that's part one. And part two, why has the progressive movement taken such hold over the world in recent decades?
No, it's not. It's not just a matter of degree. I can, if you take a look at chapter 7 of my book on conservatism, there's an analysis of this, but I'll give you the brief version. Liberals, as I said at the beginning, liberalism begins with the assumption that the political world consists of human individuals, and that they are free and equal by nature and take obligations upon themselves by consent. Marxists reject all of this. Marxists begin from the premise that human beings are sticky, that human beings form groups or classes, as Marx calls them. But classes are just groups, that there are groups of human beings who are loyal to one another, and that these groups compete in society. Now, Marx claims that the relationship between groups in society is always exploitative. Whoever is stronger is always oppressing and exploiting the weaker. And I would say that conservatives agree with Marxists that human beings naturally form groups and classes, but conservatives don't believe that exploitation and oppression of the stronger by the weaker is inherently necessarily so. So that Marxists say, look, these liberals they're basically covering for an oppressive regime, and the only answer is revolution. Right? Liberals don't talk much about revolution. Marxists say the only answer is revolution and the abolition of the most powerful group or class running society. The conservatives will say, this is all crazy stuff. What we need is some kind of accommodation between the stronger groups and the weaker groups that allows everybody to have something of what they need. That's what conservatives in general are looking for. Now, what I just said is very schematic. I've sharpened it to make the differences very clear. But as you've suggested, there is this tendency of liberalism to fall into Marxism, to become a cover for Marxism. I won't go into the dynamic in detail, but roughly the problem is that the only way that liberalism could keep from falling into Marxism would be if it were capable of transmitting itself as a stable, powerful tradition. But since liberalism is hostile to tradition and undermines every tradition by arguing for freedom, what ends up happening is that even if you like liberalism, I'm not such a big fan, but even if you like liberalism, I think you need to admit that everywhere that liberalism takes charge, within 2 or at most 3 generations, the liberalism is gone and it's turned into some kind of crazy neo-Marxist thing. And the reason is simply because liberals do not have the transmission of tradition as part of their system.
I think we might have time for just two last questions if we keep the questions very brief. Jeff, you're up.
Shalom. All ideas of the work brigade, call them crypto-communists if you like, every single one of them, taken to its logical conclusion, would be disastrous or evil, and provably so. Why on earth are the young people not able to see that? And more importantly, why can't the older ones see that there are so many national differences in people? Like, for instance, Maradona's hand of God goal was regarded by 80% of Argentinians as tenable, and there are no bull rings in Israel. So national states are very much different, and that too is a reason for not having one world government. Why on
good question.
Well, there's a few different things happening here. I'll try to touch on a couple of them. One of the main things that's happening is that universities were mischaracterized by people who spent generations calling them ivory towers. Universities are not ivory towers. They are radio towers. They are transmission towers. The universities, whatever the universities teach today, will be what the mainstream elites of the country and therefore most of society will think 20 years from now. And the failure of conservatives, traditionalists, nationalists, Orthodox Jews and Christians to understand that the universities were for generations working to overthrow everything we believe is difficult to explain. Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind in 1987, or Dinesh D'Souza's book in 1991 called Illiberal Education. These books were already very well known and their arguments were very clear. I don't know what it's going to take for example, conservative Jews to realize that these institutions are the main driver of anti-Semitism, and that we should withdraw from our involvement with them and create new institutions that are decent. That's one issue. I think a second point that's worth noting is that when young people go to universities, they are not offered a conservative alternative. Conservatives, in the real sense of conservatives, of people who are concerned with conservation and transmission of over many generations, those kinds of conservatives have faced a de facto ban on hiring for 40, 50, 60 years already. Almost everywhere. If you're a conservative, you're not going to be hired to have a university position. So when you send your children to university, what you're doing is you're sending them into an arena where the choice is between liberalism and Marxism. And young people, when they enter the classroom of a good Marxist instructor, the first thing that they realize is that the Marxist instructor is telling them truths that the liberals are hiding from them. The Marxist says, look, the liberals say that everybody's equal and everybody's free, but look around you. Do you think everybody is really equal, is really free? Society doesn't work like that. Society works on groups, and groups oppress one another. And so when young people hear the Marxist instructors saying that, they feel as though somebody's actually telling them the truth for the first time. And there's enough truth in what they're saying and enough falsity in the liberal shtick so that students in general will move towards Marxism if the choice they have is between Marxism and liberalism.
All right, we've got time for a very, very brief question. Dina Razel, last question.
Thank you. My question follows on really from that. One of the problems of propagating the idea of conservatism and nationalism is that it's often conflated, especially in young minds, with a pejorative term right wing. Could you comment on that, please? Right wing equals Nazi in their minds.
Right, sure. I'm familiar with it. It's true everywhere. That's the way that that the Bolsheviks, I mean, the actual literal historical Communist Party in Russia, that's the way that they saw it, that the idea of national independence was a bourgeois impediment to worldwide revolution. Just like the traditional family, traditional religion, also the independent nation. And so the communists have always, in their propaganda, treated nationalism and national independence, national interests, national traditions as evil and as being some kind of Nazism, and that continues today, to the extent that the universities are run by Marxists. It's not surprising that the students come out thinking, and this is true for the schools, more, the K-12 system as well, that to the extent that the teachers are some kind of progressive or Marxist or revolutionary, it's not surprising that the students come out thinking that anything conservative is Nazi and evil.
Okay, on that note, we want to thank you so much, Yoram. This is one of our more, really engaging talks we've had that really makes you think. So thank you so much for that and for all you do. I would recommend to everyone to buy your books and read them. I think there's a lot that can be learned there. How can people follow you on social media or keep up to date with the work you're doing? I'm
on Twitter, Hazony. That's the easiest on social media. You can also go to nationalconservatism.org and sign up for our weekly newsletter if you're interested. We round up videos and essays every week of interest to nationalists and conservatives, and you can just put your email address there and you'll get it in your inbox. Amazing. So nationalconservatism.org. No, nationalconservatism.org. Yep. Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Yoram. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Look forward to seeing everyone next week, and have a good week. Thank you. Okay. God bless you all. Thank you.